And to summarize kind of what we've been covering over the last couple of days is, of course, on day one, we did all of our foundational information. So, why is this important? What is 2 CFR 200? We talked about subrecipient monitoring and requirements of the pass-through entity, and kind of gave you a foundation for why it's important to understand, develop your, I'm turning off my video, sorry about that, and develop your indirect cost allocation plan. In addition, we also talked about the cost principles, which are very important when you're developing an indirect cost plan, because you have to understand the difference between your costs, a direct cost versus an indirect cost. You have to be able to separate those costs as part of your indirect cost allocation plan. You have to further separate your direct costs into direct salaries and wages and other direct costs. And then you need to make sure that all of the costs that you're including in your pools are allowable costs. And that's when we covered the basic considerations for cost principles. So basic considerations meaning you have to apply the allowability principles. Is the cost necessary? So is it necessary for the federal project? Does that cost benefit the project? Is it reasonable? Did we use arm's length bargaining? Did we follow competitive process for procurement? Those types of things. Is it a fair market value price, a market price for that cost? And then allocable. So the three main ones are necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Allocable meaning, can we identify 100% of that cost to a project, to one project, or does that cost benefit multiple cost objectives or multiple projects? And we have to come up with an allocated method to distribute those costs. And that allocated method would be your indirect cost allocation plan, or it could be fringe benefits, or it could be an equipment rate, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. In addition, we looked at the selected items of cost. So if you apply those basic considerations, necessary, reasonable, and allowable, and you still really can't figure out if the cost meets the criteria for the cost principles, there are very specific guidelines for specific types of costs. As I mentioned yesterday, it's not an all-inclusive list. So if you can't find it in the selected items of cost, it doesn't mean that that cost is unallowable. It just means it wasn't addressed in 2 CFR 200, and we have to apply those basic considerations, and we'll have to ask for prior approval. So that's why it's important before you incur costs that you ask for prior approval. And then Eric covered, we started getting into the actual development of our indirect cost plan. So we talked about centralized services cost allocation plan, which are those, I guess, government-wide services that are provided to agencies, and those can be included in your indirect cost pools. Centralized services could also be at the entity level. So if you're going to do a multiple rate method, you could possibly do a centralized services cost allocation within your own entity. In addition to the different types of methods, a simplified method, which would be one rate, or a multiple rate method, which would be multiple rates by department. Eric also talked about the different types of rates that you all can apply or that are available for indirect costs. Those being fixed with carry forward, which means that you create a rate at the beginning of the year, you bill that rate at the end of the year, you look at your actuals, and your adjustments, your over or under adjustments, are carried over into the next year's rate. We also have a predetermined rate with a final rate, or I'm sorry, not predetermined, a provisional rate with a final rate. A provisional rate similar to a fixed with carry forward. It's authorized using estimates at the beginning. You bill that throughout the year, and then at the end of the year, you have to look at your actuals, and like Eric mentioned yesterday, you have to go back and make a modification to every cost objective or project that provisional rate was applied to, and adjust it to what the final rate is. So that rate is a little bit burdensome and is not a good rate for state DOTs to use because they have so many projects. but it is a good rate for locals that may only have 1 or 2 projects. Then in addition, he talked about predetermined rate, which allows us to authorize a rate for a little bit longer than 1 year, up to 4 years. And we negotiate something less than what your actuals are because that rate is not adjusted. And so because the federal government is not going to pay more than our fair share of indirect costs, if you want to use a predetermined rate, we're most likely going to negotiate something less than what your actuals are because that rate is not adjusted. And because all of those different rates have different rules, it really depends on what your organization wants to do. And like Eric mentioned several times yesterday, what is your objective for claiming indirect costs? And that's going to kind of guide what type of rate that you choose. In addition to the rates, we'll go ahead and just jump right in here to the de minimis indirect cost rate. But before I do that, I'm just going to ask if there's any questions that anybody had from the content yesterday or the first day, and we can ask those questions now. And then if there's no questions, we can get back into the info. I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity. And feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat pod. Okay. All right, so I'm going to cover these last few slides. As I mentioned, we just talked about the main rates that Federal Highway use or that are in 2 CFR 200 that Federal Highway can authorize. In addition to those normal rates, we also have these more unique rates. We have a de minimis indirect cost rate, and Eric did cover this yesterday, but I wanted to just make sure we didn't go too fast over it and make sure everybody understands, because there were some changes in 2 CFR 200, as Eric mentioned yesterday, previous to the November 12th, 2020 update to 2 CFR 200. The only entities that could use a de minimis rate were entities that had never, ever had a negotiated indirect cost rate before with their Cognizant agency. And the other criteria is entities have to receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding. So if your entity receives less than $35 million in direct federal funding, and the new requirements say you don't currently have a negotiated indirect cost rate, so maybe you've had one in the past, but you don't currently have one now, you can claim, if you meet these 2 criteria, you can claim a de minimis rate. What the de minimis rate is it's 10%, and it can only be applied to modified total direct costs as defined in 2 CFR 200.1. And basically what modified total direct cost means is it includes the normal direct salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, services, which would be like professional services, travel, and subawards and subcontracts up to the first 25,000. The important part to remember on a de minimis is you cannot charge the 10% to these excluded items. That would be equipment. So that would be whether it's a capital purchase of equipment or if it's an equipment rate, you cannot charge the 10%. Any capital expenditure, you cannot charge 10%. In Federal Highway Administration, a contractor payment, because that contractor is being hired to improve an asset, the roadway, contract payments are capital expenditures. So you cannot charge the 10% to contractor payments. You can charge them to consultant agreements, professional services, but you cannot charge any type of the de minimis to a contractor payment. Rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, and any portion of the subawards greater than $25,000, you cannot charge the 10% to. So when you're developing or you're deciding to use a de minimis rate, you have to show that your systems are able to exclude those costs that should not be applied the 10%. So that's very important. As long as you meet these 2 criteria, you don't have to develop a whole plan. You can use this 10% indefinitely until the above criteria is not met. And we have to still make sure that we're doing a consistent charge or of an indirect or a direct. So you can't say, well, we're using de minimis now, so we're gonna we're going to call this cost a direct cost and apply the 10% when technically that cost would be considered an indirect cost in your normal course of business. The other thing I wanted to just remind you all, because Eric did mention it yesterday, is it would be difficult to bounce around between a de minimis and a regular rate because, for one, you can't currently have a negotiated rate. So if you currently have a rate and it expires, say, on September 30th, and you want to start on October 1st applying a de minimis rate, there would have to be a lot of lead time in order for us to approve that. And then if the next year you wanted to go and develop another ICAP, you would have to get that submitted within 6 months of the end of your fiscal year. And so it really doesn't make any sense to bounce around between one rate and another because it is burdensome to develop a plan. If you've already developed a plan and you have a good methodology, I recommend using a normal indirect cost allocation versus a de minimis rate. Because a de minimis rate, because it excludes a lot of those costs and you can only apply it to certain things, you're most likely not going to get reimbursed what your actual indirects are if you charge a de minimis rate. So once again, you have to think about what's your objective. Do you want to just get reimbursed as much as you can using a de minimis, reduce the burden without having to develop an ICAP, and just get as much as you can through the de minimis? That's a good objective. Or if you're required to claim the maximum amount of indirects, then a de minimis probably is not going to work for your organization. So a narrative cost allocation method, and this one is similar to, Eric talked yesterday about special rates, where if you develop an indirect cost allocation plan, that is going to be for your entire program. But then there are things that happen. There are special circumstances. There might be a major project. There could be an ER event. There could be a lot of different things that could happen where you're not going to be able to apply your regular indirect cost rate, but you're incurring indirect costs or you're incurring costs that may be difficult to specifically allocate to projects. And so we have a narrative cost allocation methodology that can be used, but this is used in special cases. This is going to be like the special rate. Instead of developing a special rate for an ER event, you're going to develop a methodology. And basically all a methodology does is it identifies, and while it's not a specific rate, maybe you identify a proportional benefit. I'll give you an example. We have a couple examples down here. Vermont and California both have narrative cost allocation methodologies. California's, I believe, is for the LPA program. One thing to remember, and this is in on the second bullet there, it says must be developed, documented, and submitted to the Cognizant agency for indirect costs for approval. But a narrative cost allocation methodology could be for indirect costs, it could be for direct costs, and it could also be for a combination of direct and indirect costs. And so, for example, I'll give you a more recent example. Alaska had an earthquake a couple years ago. There was a significant earthquake, there was an ER event, and they had several ER projects that they had to do as a result of the earthquake. So, of course, if you're familiar with our ER process, they had to go out and do a lot of damage assessments. They, assessed everything. They incurred a lot of costs that were directly related to the ER event. But as part of the damage assessment, that's where you're starting to identify your projects and that kind of thing. So they were able to collect the costs, and they were able to eventually identify the projects that they were going to have for the ER event. But those initial costs were not specifically allocated to any specific project. So they ended up having 10, I believe it was 10 ER projects, and each project had a different value. And so what they did was they took each project, whatever the cost of that project was, the proportion of that cost is as a proportion of the total ER event. So of the 10 projects, each of those 10 projects had a piece of the total ER event, and whatever that proportion was, they are distributing those other direct costs that they incurred as part of the damage assessment and that kind of thing proportionately to those ER projects. And so basically what they did to develop this plan is they had to write this methodology. So they had to write a document that basically explained everything that I kind of just said there, to explain how they're going to allocate those costs. So instead of applying a percentage, they're applying another methodology, a proportional methodology that they're going to spread it across. In addition to a narrative, we can either proportionally distribute across multiple projects, but narrative also allows us to create one project in FEMAS that can be the narrative cost allocation project, and costs can be charged to that. But you still have to develop your methodology on how you're going to collect your costs and make sure that those costs are going to be submitted to the project in an appropriate manner. So this is just another way that you can allocate costs for instead of using a rate, but just remember you have to use this in special circumstances, and it has to be approved and reviewed and signed off by the division office or by your Cognizant agency for indirect costs. So in addition, in Appendix 7, because that's kind of where all this information comes from, at the very bottom of Appendix 7 towards the end, it says that it talks about methodologies using other than rates, which was that narrative cost allocation methodology that we just talked about. Then it also talks about fringe benefit rates. So if fringe benefit rates are not part of your central services, your statewide or your government-wide central services, then you can create your own fringe benefit rate and submit that to your Cognizant agency for indirect cost at the same time as when you're submitting your regular ICAP. An ICAP has to be approved by your Cognizant agency for indirect costs, but also any other kind of allocation methods that you're doing also have to be submitted to the Cognizant agency. So fringe benefit rates, narrative cost allocation methodologies, special rates, and equipment rates. Equipment rates, if you remember from yesterday when we talked about our cost principles, we said that capital expenditures are not an allowable cost to be billed as an allowable cost directly to a project, unless the federal awarding agency says it's okay, which normally for general purpose equipment, Federal Highway does not allow our funds to procure general purpose equipment. And equipment can also not be charged as an indirect cost. And we're talking about the capital purchase. So how do we get reimbursed for equipment? We still participate in equipment, but we have to think about what is equipment. It's something that has a useful life of greater than a year. And so it doesn't make sense for us to procure and charge the full capital price to one project, because that piece of equipment is most likely going to benefit many projects. So what do we have to do? The best way is to develop an equipment rate. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is a rate sheet that was developed by a state DOT, and I'm just going to talk about just one example, but just to give you an idea, this is all of their rates that they've developed for the state DOT. So they've come up with either a mileage or an hourly rate for all of their different types of equipment. And how did they come up with this rate? So AE, so they've identified all of their pieces of equipment by class. So the AE class is an intermediate sedan. So I'm just going to focus on this one. They have a whole bunch of different types of equipment, but a sedan is one that's most likely going to be used on a federal aid project, because if an engineer is going to go drive out and do an inspection, most likely they're going to take a government vehicle or a state DOT vehicle, and it could very well be one of these sedans. So they have to figure out, they went out and procured all of these with state dollars, and then they've come up with what their costs are. And in this particular state, they've went ahead and done a weighted average across 4 years. You don't necessarily have to do that. This is more accurate, doing, looking at an average over a course of several years instead of just looking at 1 year. But this is basically the way that they've identified how they are going to create their rates. So first we identify what is the class, then how many units, how many vehicles do they have? And notice we have 16, 17, 18, and 19 are our fiscal years. So if we're looking at just in 19, they had 11 intermediate sedans. Their total depreciation expense for the year for those 11 sedans was $17,000. Total repairs for the sedans was 6,900s, and the total operating costs, which would include fuel and that kind of thing, was $9,400. So they have a total for just 19 of $34,000, and they've done the same thing for all of their prior years. Then they come up with their usage rate. And notice down here, and I'm not going to go into all these different tabs, but they have given us the backup documentation. So they're basically saying how many miles were these 13 units driven in this year. So this is all miles. So then we're coming up with a mileage rate. So cost, miles, mileage rate. And so you can see they've come up with a mileage rate for each year. They have an average rate of 40 cents, 40.72 cents. And then over here, you can see that we have an over-under amount. So every year, just like you would do on, say, a fixed with carry forward or your fringe benefit rate, we want to look at, this is based on estimates. So, we're looking at, this is for FY 2021, and our most recent numbers are from 2019. So it's very likely that these are not going to be exactly correct. And so we want to look at every year, what is our over-under adjustment? Did we overbill or underbill? And we need to carry forward that over amount or under amount into our next year, and it's going to adjust our rates. You can see on this one, they overbilled a little bit, and so it reduced their rate by 4 cents. So this is another allocation methodology to allocate equipment cost to projects. So now this is an equitable allocation. Every time an engineer drives out to a project, they can say, hey, I drove 50 miles, I charge 40.72 cents a mile. We charge it directly to that project, and it's an equitable allocation, and the state gets reimbursed, we participate, and that vehicle can be used on many different activities, and we can equitably charge the value of that vehicle to all of those different activities. So let me just go back here. Go back to the slides. Any questions on equipment rates or fringe benefit rates? I showed you the fringe benefit rate sheet yesterday, but basically it's the same exact thing. You get that your payroll, so what's your total payroll? You identify what are all of your fringe benefits for the year, and you just do the math. Fringe benefits divided by total payroll, you get a percentage, and then you look at what you billed last year, and you make your adjustments for your carry forward.
So I have a question about the
yes.
So in our case, we have our construction inspectors who are out inspecting projects all day long. They're putting on their timesheet how much time they're spending at each of these projects, but I'm not aware that we have been keeping track of mileage. So is that mileage just one type of way? Just having it on the timesheet, is that sufficient?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one thing I didn't mention is it's completely up to your organization if you want to claim an equipment rate. What you can also do, and this might be what's happening in your organization, if you're not seeing mileage charges or any type of equipment charge, is we can put these costs into our indirect cost pool. So these can be our equipment, depreciation can be included in either your indirect cost pool, or it can be included as part of a rate. So like I said yesterday, when we're talking about fringe benefits, if your organization chooses to develop a fringe benefit rate, then your indirect cost plan should show that all of those fringe benefits are excluded from your pools because you're already getting reimbursed through the fringe benefit rate. It would be the same exact thing with equipment rates. If your organization chooses to develop equipment rates and bill these as a direct cost, so you're developing a rate and you're billing them basically directly to projects as a direct cost, then you would need to exclude all of these costs from any of your indirect cost pools. If you don't want to develop an indirect rate an equipment rate for your equipment, you can just dump all of your depreciation for every single bit of your equipment into your indirect cost pool, all of your repair costs into your indirect cost pool, all of your operating costs into your indirect cost pool, and that would be calculated into your indirect rate. So you could just bill all of those costs via an indirect rate. Now it's going to make your indirect rate a lot higher because you're adding a lot more costs, but you're also not billing an equipment rate directly to projects as you're using the equipment. So in the end, you should get reimbursed for those costs and the federal government will pay their fair share. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
You bet. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Eric here. So this last few slides here, these were some of the read ahead materials. I'm sure Eric covered that yesterday. And so for the rest of today, what we're going to be covering is we're going to take the foundational information and all the cost principles that we covered yesterday. And now we're going to apply all of that to looking at an ICAP and applying it to the documentation and what type of documentation is necessary for submittal for an ICAP. And Eric's going to cover all of that. So with that, I'm going to ask one more time if there's any other questions from yesterday or anything that I just covered. And if not, I'm going to unshare and let Eric take over.
Thanks, Bob. Let's just take a look at this and it might better explain. The answer is if 200% is accurate in the methodology and the way the ICAP and the indirect costs are developed in the cost pools, then 200% would not be too high. But let's take a look at a lot of times what people are talking about when they look at a rate. So with your direct salaries and wages on the left side, you can see the indirect costs are $1,068,000. And over to the right, your total direct cost on the, if you're using total direct cost as your base, we're using the same indirect cost. So the organization has the same amount of indirect costs regardless of what base they use. That makes sense. On the left side, you see the direct salaries of only $892,000. And if you're using direct salaries and wages, you would have an indirect cost rate of 119.72%. And then to prove that out, that bottom line there on the left says 119.72% times your direct salaries is going to equate to your indirects. So if you're using direct salaries and wages with 119%, you're still going to recover all your indirect costs. You move over to the right, and really the only thing that's changed is you're using a total direct cost as your base, which is a lot more than just your direct salaries and wages. So your total direct costs, using that as a base, you have $2.1 million. And under that scenario, your rate is only 48%. So there's a big difference between 119% and 48%. But as you look at the bottom on the right, you prove it out. And in either scenario, regardless of the base that you use, your percentage is different, but your recovery is exactly the same. So, a lot of times we've heard in developing this class and presenting it to other DOTs, it's like, well, our percent is, 200% or 205. We've seen them even higher than that. And some other individuals might shake their head and say, wow, how does that happen? Well, this is how it happens right here. It all depends on the base. It all depends on how the methodology is. And the example that I'm going to show you today also has a rate that's over 100%. And we'll kind of go through that. So this was just to show you the differences between the different cost bases and what that can do to your percentage.
And Eric, while you're pulling up or sharing your screen, I just want to say one more thing. And this goes to kind of what I was talking about in fringe and equipment. If here's another thing is like, if you were to look at that and you were to say, okay, it's a 48% rate on direct salaries and wages, but then that entity also had a fringe rate, and that fringe rate was, let's say, another 20%, and then they had equipment rates. Well, if their fringe costs and their equipment costs were included in their indirect cost pool, that would also make their indirect rate go higher. but then they're not going to have a fringe rate that they're charging. So all of those things can affect and impact, what the rate is. So that's why it's really important that you don't just look at a rate and automatically say it's too much or not enough, because it all depends on the dollars and the costs that are going into it. It depends on, do they have any other rates or allocation methods out there that they're applying, a lot of different things. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's right, Bob. And that brings me to something else I can share with you. So we're currently working with a DOT, and they have all the above. They have an indirect cost allocation plan. They have a fringe rate. They have an equipment rate. They have, I think, 2 narrative cost allocation plans. They also have a special rate for some of the activities that they do. I think they're up in and around like 6 different rates they're charging. And just a note here, at some point, with regards to administrative burden, and we're starting to do this with this DOT, we're starting to say, hey, if you took your equipment rate and created an equipment rate pool within your ICAP, if you included your fringe rate that you're currently charging and put that in its own pool within your overall ICAP, and you can trim down on the number of indirect cost plans that you have by consolidating a little bit. Now, we don't see that a lot, but we do have one DOT that, it seems like every couple of years they want to create another rate for something, and that's perfectly fine. But the finance people and the auditors and the people responsible for developing the ICAP, at some point, there's probably a benefit for a consolidation there. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay, so like Bob mentioned, we want to talk about methodology and application, and we're going to spend a lot of time in some of the examples that you have. But before we do so, I kind of want to revisit what we started off with. And this was a slide in the very beginning, and that is, what should you know? And I'm just going to rifle through these just as a reminder, because as we open up the actual example, these are the things we're going to be looking for. So what's the objective? We beat that one pretty hard. What are they trying to accomplish? This could dictate what base they use. It could also dictate what their indirect cost pools, if they're going to be excluding anything, and so on and so forth. One of the ICAPs that the example that we're going to be showing you, actually, they had a beginning goal of they wanted to recover like 15 million bucks. That's what they were looking to do. And so they were able to exclude a lot of things and trim it down and basically play with the numbers. Now, I know that's a horrible thing to say, especially with a group of auditors, playing with numbers. But during the development process, you can start doing some different scenario-based calculations to see where that's going to put you to meet whatever objective you're looking for. Another one is it compliant with regulation? We beat you guys to death with regulations both day and one. We're not going to do that today and tomorrow, I promise. But putting all of those things together that we've already talked about, Appendix 7, all those requirements, the cost principles, responsibilities for oversight, subrecipient monitoring, the list goes on and on. But that's kind of where this one lies. So we always want to keep an eye out for that. Are there systems? Now, we keep bringing this back up, but these are very important questions that you're going to have to determine from the subrecipient, because it might be easy to develop a plan. That's one thing, throwing it on paper. Hey, this is our methodology. This is what we're going to do. But early on in your discussion, if you're helping an entity develop, early on, you have to make them aware of their system capabilities when it comes to applying the rate. Remember, I said a couple of times, whatever methodology you're using to develop the rate, you have to use the same methodology in applying it, meaning like the simplified method or the multiple rate method. Obviously, what base you're going to use, and so on and so forth. So this is just really important to keep in mind and something to convey to subrecipients or other entities that are submitting. And it should probably be done up front. It's like, okay, your plan looks great, but is your system going to be able to do this accurately throughout the period? The other one we talked about is the supporting documentation in order? We're going to be looking at that today. So tomorrow we're going to go over what we call the ICAP review guide. Sherry will be sharing that with you at the end of today's session. Kind of a read ahead. It's not a big lift by no means, but that's what we'll be covering tomorrow. And it's kind of a checklist that you can use to verify that, everything is in there. Just to make sure that you've got all the right stuff. What direct cost base are they using? That should be identified in there very clearly. You'll see that in our example. What type of indirect cost rate are they proposing? That obviously needs to be in there. We'll see that. Is the rate proposed accurate? And this is where you get into your number crunching. This is where you have to do your due diligence if you're reviewing ICAPs, and really take a look at their pools, take a look at their calculations, tie out various numbers that they're showing. You can look at their direct costs from their various different departments or activities. You can look at their indirect cost pools, and we'll do a little bit of that today as well.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
There was a question in the chat pod from Daniel Burke saying, I imagine the Cognizant agency and the auditors will eventually be able to group fringe benefits to a final cost objective. For example, employees direct charging hours to projects, which would make it a direct cost, is my understanding correct? And that is correct. Fringe benefits could be a direct cost or they could be an indirect cost. If you have a fringe benefit rate, then whenever your employee is charging their time, then we're also charging directly the fringe benefit rate as well. So those would be considered, if we're charging a fringe benefit rate, those are considered direct costs. If we're including fringe benefits in your indirect cost pool and you're not charging a fringe benefit rate, then your fringe benefits would be considered an indirect cost. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, great question, Daniel. Okay, so like I said, we're not going to beat you to death today on foundational 2 CFR 200 and other requirements. So right away, we just want to jump right into the required doc. Actually, let me do a slide first. That'll kind of lead us into what we're doing here. So these are just a list, and we're going to open up the example and just take a look at these. You have a copy of these. I believe it starts on page 108, I think, for you guys as participant once I open it up, and that'll be the example ICAP. But is what we'll see when we go in there is a letter of transmittal from the requesting organization. You're going to see the certification by that requesting organization. We'll look at that. And then there's this quick summary in the front that talks about the type of rate, the rate period, the rate proposed. There's an organization chart that's required. Let's take a look at page number 2 before I go in there. It's a copy of relevant financial data. Historical mainly, but then there's always some room in the narrative to identify any upcoming costs that you may realize or that the organization realizes going into the next period. Obviously, a breakdown of direct costs, the direct cost base, what that looks like, breakdown of the indirect costs, the various pools. All of that is what you should be seeing in the ICAP. And some of the questions I was asking before was, a lot of these requirements, basically these 2 slides, a cursory, if you receive an ICAP, and this could just be a suggestion, but even under a risk-based type scenario, you could do a cursory review that could, quite possibly take 20 or 30 minutes just to ensure the bare bones basic stuff. And I'm sure you guys probably already do that. By no means am I saying that you're not under the risk-based scenario, but a cursory review, recognizing that at minimum the required documentation that's needed, and then based on your risk, your risk appetite or whatever you're set at there, that you take that deeper dive. That fourth bullet there is where we really get into the statements of explanations, and this is really, really important. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at those today, but the methodology used, any deviations from previous rate calculations, any factors that are affecting that rate calculation, and then the summary of the essential services plan that Bob talked about yesterday. So with that being said, let's go ahead. And yeah, this is page 108 of your participant guide if you want to follow along. I just want to take a look at this ICAP example, and we might bounce out and look at the workbook for some of the supporting documentation, but we're going to take this kind of slow. Now, if you're in there, I know we have a couple of local public agencies that might be on the call, or some other organizations. If you're developing an ICAP, this is what they should pretty much look like. Now, by no means is this example perfect. Some things may be in different order. You'll see in this example that sometimes they went above and beyond to kind of explain their methodology, which is refreshing. And I'll kind of explain that as we go along, because it's painting a picture of really not only the organization, how the organization is put together, but it's also painting a picture of how they're coming up with their rate and their pools and so on. So this is just a transmittal letter, and this one is coming from, it's not a transmittal letter. This is actually an agreement letter that would come from the Cognizant agency. So here it's coming from the FHWA division office that would go back to that agency and approve their rate. And you can see there it talks about what type of a rate it is, the period that it is, and the base and so on. So, and then it's signed by, in you all's case, it'd be signed by a representative from Caltrans approving that rate. So that's the one that goes back to the organization. This is the transmittal letter that comes from that entity requesting the rate. Now, there's a lot of information in here that you'll also see in the ICAP, but this is an agreement between the Cognizant agency and the recipient or subrecipient. There's a lot of information here, and I want to point out some of them, obviously. And oh, by the way, as far as the agreement is concerned, you all could use this as a template if you want to, and just kind of fine tune it for yourself. But here they talk about the rate. In this case, it was a predetermined rate. You've got a spot there for the period. There's the actual rate that they're requesting. There's their base. So all of this is right up front. Notice that they put some unique language in here too that corresponds with the requirements that we've talked about last couple of days. So this one says exclusive of extraordinary distorting expenditures. So it's nice to see stuff like this in the agreement, because you're bringing forth those requirements that are outlined for an ICAP right into the documentation that's being submitted. Here's page 2. Obviously, if it's not a predetermined rate, it could be a fixed with carried forward, but they identify here what that's all about. Here it has to do, sorry, I jumped ahead, but here's some accounting changes. It talks about their system here, talks about their accounting system, and the accounting system that they have in effect right now, and that what they will have in effect during that period. And if there's any changes, then they could notify the Cognizant agency. Here's a good statement on the agreement that talks about use by other federal agencies. So for FHWA, when we approve state DOT ICAP, because we are the Cognizant agency for all the departments of transportation across the country, but once we approve a rate, then they can use that rate for other federal programs. So that's what that statement talks about. And as you can tell, this agreement here is pretty much designed for DOTs and FHWA, but it could easily be used as a template for Caltrans or any other cognizant agency for an ICAP agreement. So those are just the first two documents of the package that you would normally see. Then we actually get into the indirect cost rate proposal. This was done in February, and this is Vermont. This is one we've done recently, and I'll kind of shed some light on that as we kind of go through. Well, let me shed a little bit on it right now. So Vermont came to FHWA. They've never claimed any indirect cost in the past. COVID-19 hit pretty much, organizations across the country. Everybody knows about it. And there were a lot of hard times with states, specifically the closing of parks, all kinds of different state-run activities, were closed down. Revenue kind of shrunk here and there, pretty much across the board. So we saw an uptick with departments of transportation, and basically because of the state being short on revenues because of the impact of the pandemic, started to have to look at their budgets, had to look at, how they're going to continue to operate. And indirect costs was one way or one method that they could use to, balance their budget and continue full operations, is by having the federal government assist with their indirect costs. So that's where Vermont was at. They'd never developed a rate. Most of their financial management team that they had there were not familiar with indirect cost rates. They weren't familiar with the regulations. And Bob and I pretty much had to take them from square zero and move them through the development process of a indirect cost allocation plan. And we did that in about a 7-month period of time. The good thing is they got started early. So their fiscal year is July 1st through June 30th. And we started in late July of the year before. So they just now started applying their brand new and first indirect cost rate to their program this year. But we actually got it done in February. So it took us about 7 months to do. Okay, so back to the example. This is Vermont's. We've asked them if we could share their numbers and they didn't mind. And we're just using it as an example anyway. I've gone through and kind of changed everything. So anywhere you see TA, that just means transportation agency. So I've kind of replaced the name, but really doesn't matter. So this is your contents, and you can kind of see a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about that came right out of Appendix 7 yesterday, all the various things that are included in the package. And like I say, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty good there. So the introduction, this is something that will tell you a lot about the agency. This, they pull a lot of information out of Appendix 7 here. It says right here, the ICAP is submitted for agency approval each year as required within 6 months. So they've recognized that and actually included it in the package. Let's see if there's something else in here. They're making a statement in this package that basically it's developed within the regulations and requirements. And then they've outlined 2 CFR 200 and also Appendix 7 to be specific. So the nice thing about seeing a plan that includes a lot of references that we talked about the last couple of days, like for instance, the cost principles and so on and so forth, is what that does for the reviewing cognizant agency is that we know, because they've included these various statements throughout the package, that we know they're aware of them. And that's something we had to do with Vermont, is make them aware of the requirements and all of these things that go in and considerations. And then as they became aware and they did their due diligence to meet those various criteria and requirements, they just included it in the package. So it's kind of neat when you're seeing that stuff written in here. So here's the objective of the plan. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I do want to point out certain areas that are good. So obviously, here's a definition of our indirect cost. They recognize that it's a cost benefit benefits more than one cost objective and can't be readily identified with a normal project. That's kind of cool. They recognize that. This is a good one here. A cost may not be allocated to a federal award as an indirect if any other cost incurred for the same purpose, meaning like they can't double or duplicate a cost. It can't be a direct cost being already applied to a federal award if it's going to be an indirect cost or in the indirect cost pool. Once again, they recognize that, which is good. Oops, jumped too far ahead. Here they talk about is how they did their indirect costs is they did it by each department, carrying out the federal awards. And you'll see that as we go through here, how they've done that. Some indirect cost allocation plans are not by department. They could be by an activity or something similar. Here we go. Cost specifically identified as unallowable, which is a good thing, and charged to the federal awards, either directly or indirectly, will be refunded, included interest, and so on. They recognize that if there is an unallowable that's identified later through an audit or something, that they'll have to pay it back. And this is a nice little statement. They recognize they're not getting any extra funds here. We talked about that in the very beginning. It was one of our poll questions. Is there any extra dollars coming because of this indirect cost plan? They recognize that it's not. Then we move right to the summary. And if you guys have any questions as you're following along with me, by all means, you can stop me if there's anything in here. In this summary, I'm kind of keeping an eye on time. We'll take a break in about 10 minutes, but in the summary, it continues on. And here we talk about what the proposed indirect cost rate is going to be, what the period is going to be, July 1st through June 30th of 2023. This was a 2-year predetermined, so you're familiar with that. And they identify, once again, the direct cost base used as direct salaries and wages. So that's just kind of a repeat. But this is a nice little summary here. And I had a question I wanted to ask everybody out there on this one. But this in one specific area, right up in the very beginning, it gives a lot of the basic information. Who's their cognizant agency, the period, the rate, what allocation method they're using, their direct cost base, and then they start throwing some numbers at there. They show you what your actual indirect cost rate is and what the proposed is. So just in one glance on this summary page, and Bob and I really like this part of it, when you open up an ICAP, sometimes, you'll see a narrative that goes on for 3 pages, and, all of a sudden you'll see one line somewhere in page 6 somewhere saying that the requested rate is this. So this is nice. They put it up front. It's also good for leadership within that organization to recognize exactly what they're doing with their ICAP, and anybody else that takes a look at it. So this is, we really like this summary page that they put together. And then right away, they go into historical data. Now, we talked about historical data. Typically, and Bob mentioned it just this morning about the, what years do you use? And typically, if you're developing a rate, well, you don't have the certified financial statements from the most recent year. So usually it's 2 years back is the audited and completed numbers that you would use. And so for this specific case right here, they used FY 18, 19, and 20 because they didn't have 21 data yet. So here it's pretty straightforward. They show the indirect cost. They have them separated between federal, state, local, and then the totals over here. They have their direct salaries and wages in there for all 3 years. And you can see going down this right column in 18, if they would have had a rate, it would have been 150%. If in 19, it would have been 146, and in 20, it would have been 152 if they had a rate. So once again, this is just a summary of the historical data. The workbook that I showed you on day one, I think we just glanced over it. We'll open it up again today, but that one really goes into the details and starts showing where these pools came from, where that indirect cost dollar amount comes from all the various indirect cost pools that they put together. Direct salaries and wages, I'll show you that too. And all of this is just information pulled from their finance system. And then down here, they had, they showed a variance, but they also wanted to identify what portion of the proceeds from the federal program were being recognized in here. So that's what that little area is down there. Okay, this is a quick one here. Certification of indirects. Now, all of this stuff is, like I said, required as being part of the package. The letters and so on and so forth, the type of rate, the period. But then we get into the certification. This is right out of Appendix 7. All of the indirect cost plans or proposals we get from the state's DOT have this, and it's literally cut and pasted right out of Appendix 7 and pasted right into their ICAP. It's one of our policies that we have at FHWA that we want the exact thing, the exact certification that's identified in Appendix 7, and that's what you see here. And if you're not familiar with it, it's just basically a certification that the indirect costs are not duplicated in other direct costs, and if there's any changes, and you can kind of take your time and read it. But this is standard in all of our indirect cost plans that we see. Your org chart, I mentioned this on day one, just kind of want to revisit it. This is also a requirement in Appendix 7. This one's kind of unique because they were able to identify the departments, whether they're going to be indirect, direct, or even excluded from the ICAP. And we'll get to that piece in a minute. You can see the Department of Motor Vehicles was excluded from their indirect cost plan. And when I say excluded, they're not claiming any indirect costs from the Department of Motor Vehicles, and they're also not including any salaries or wages from that department either. Same with the central garage. So this is kind of neat because once you get into the workbook and you start looking at the supporting documentation and the numbers for all of these, you start to recognize these various departments as being direct cost departments or indirect cost departments. Let's see if there's any questions. Okay, continue to go here for a few more minutes and then we'll take a break. So then we get into the methodology, and I'll spend a little more extra time on this. So this document basically describes the methodology and the processes to allocate. And when I say the purposes and the processes that and the procedures and the systems and everything, it's really outlined here. I think Vermont maybe did a little bit of an overkill, but at the same time, it's refreshing to see it in a document. And I'll explain why now, and then you'll see it as we go. But one of the things we were pushing to Vermont when they were developing this is, don't forget that because this was your first time developing this cost plan, that the maintenance of that plan, monitoring of your indirect costs, the monitoring of your salaries and wages, your base, and monitoring the plan from year to year is going to have to be something that's written in your standard operating procedures to protect the integrity of how this thing is put together for various personnel that may transfer out and come in. And so what you see here is also in their standard operating procedures in developing their indirect cost rate. So that's good. So right up front, they talk about the allocation base as being direct salaries and wages. Now they start to talk about their system. They've identified what system they have. And specifically here, it says any adjustments throughout the year to correct direct salaries and wages are included in the base. So they've recognized that there could be some adjustments as time goes along. And then right away, they go right into the Department of Motor Vehicles. And I'm not going to read any of this because it really doesn't matter. But the bottom line is the Department of Motor Vehicles was removed from the calculation, and they give all the reasons why. Likewise, the central garage was removed from all of our calculations. And you'll see that when we go into the workbook. So once again, they're explaining everything they're doing in a narrative methodology fashion. And then once you get to the workbook and start looking at numbers, you'll see everything that they've done here and from this narrative version of it. Then here they talk about the average base from the state fiscal year. And then that was before removing DMV. So they've done, you can tell they've done their due diligence in doing calculations and so on. Also here, they identify, and Bob mentioned it this morning, but the payroll load factor, which is what they call their fringe benefit, was removed. And the reason why is because they already have a fringe rate. So any fringe benefits that are included or they charge as a separate rate are not included in here. And you'll see that once we get into the documentation. And then prior to, as they continue, their direct payroll before removing the load factor, they show that in column 1. And then after removing the load factor, you can see that in column 2. So they're just representing their calculations after removing those various departments from their calculation, which is it's good because once again, they recognize it and they're aware of it and they're talking about it to where the Cognizant agency can better understand how this whole thing is put together. I cannot tell you how important that really is. And when Margaret mentioned that, they spend 10 hours, talking to the consultant, that doesn't surprise me a bit. I probably, Bob and I helped develop this. So we were in constant communication with Vermont DOT in developing this, but even after they submitted the plan, I still ended up calling the data guy, the guy that pulls all the data from the system, and I had some questions. And those questions basically surrounded, what does this mean? Where can I find it? How did you represent it? Just some common questions. Because as a Cognizant agency, we have a responsibility to make sure that we understand what they're doing and what they're representing is actually accurate. Okay, so here is, we asked them to show this. And when I go into the workbook, you'll recognize why we asked them to do this. But these are descriptions from their financial management system about what these, so you'll see a column in there that says EA. And so we looked at their workbook. I'm like, well, what is EA? And so, that's an expenditure in account. I said, well, can you please tell us that? That way we understand what we're looking at. And so they included it in the ICAP. The TC is the transition code, and you'll see all these in columns in the supporting documentation. Before I go ahead and pick back up, I do want to address Margaret's question in the chat pod, though. Margaret shared with us the basically the perspective that she is involved with ICAPs or indirect cost rate plans. And in her context, it's with the local city public works agency, capital projects. So this example that we're using is from a state's Department of Transportation, Vermont specifically. The reason why we're using this example, and trust me, and all the auditors are very well aware of this, that all ICAPs are going to have a different shape. They're going to have a different flavor. They're going to have different components, different complexities. Their indirect cost pools are going to look different from one organization to the next. I think on day one, I talked about when we were talking about direct cost basis, and I said, comparing a manufacturing organization that produces a product where they may have warehouses and machines, developing the product is going to look far different than, say, a service providing organization. Somebody that provides a service where individuals go out and do some sort of an activity or a task. Is far different from a manufacturing or a product producing organization. So pretty much all the ICAPs that you see are going to have a different look to them. They're going to be different. And that's why we're using this is because, and I've said it a couple of times, but it's important to understand that organization because you've got to understand what they do. You have to understand what services they provide, what products they produce, what work they do, what activities they're involved in to really understand once you get into the number crunching and once you start looking at the cost pools of how that all makes sense. This example is what's important about this example, more important than the actual indirect cost pools that for their organization of transportation or the project construction or all the stuff that a transportation agency would do. The most important thing is the requirements that are outlined within the document. All of Appendix 7, when you're dealing with a federal agency, you've got to follow Appendix 7 and all the required documentation. And the reason why we use this example is because it includes all of that. More so and equally as important is the narrative and the methodology of how they're explaining how they put their indirect cost rate proposal together. As a Cognizant agency, you've got to understand how it's pieced together. Otherwise, you're looking at a bunch of information that fails to describe how it's all going to work and the methodology of how they came up with their actual percentage that they want to claim. So I hope that answers the question. Every ICAP, even though this is a good example, and that's why we chose this one to use, there's a ton of them out there. Like I mentioned, we have 33 departments of transportation claiming indirect costs, and every single one of their indirect cost rate proposals are different. They look different. Their methodologies are different. Their types of rates, their bases are different. Their systems are different. And we've mentioned systems many a times, and I'm a finance guy, so I'm always thinking about, what can the financial management system do? But, you're going to see you're going to see small organizations. It could be a small county or a township or something of that nature that, might be using QuickBooks. Or if it's a really small organization that, you're reviewing a de minimis rate for or something of that, they could even be using Microsoft Excel. So there's just a large variety and so many different complexities involved in these plans. I think is what we're trying to convey here is that if you have a plan that does a really good job of narrative and methodology, and it's easy to follow, and it's easy to take a look at the supporting documentation, then you have a good product. And you as a Cognizant agency in reviewing that product, meaning the ICAP itself, you're going to have a much better understanding and a much easier, way to go forward. Also, in being independent, the audit department, I'll just call it the audit department from Caltrans, but I know we mentioned a lot of times you guys deal with consultants and so on, but the more that you reach out and help these organizations in development. If you tell them, hey, I reviewed your ICAP, you're missing some things, let's get that straight. I know you guys already do all that because that's what we do. But the more you help these subrecipients and other organizations that are claiming indirect costs through the program, the more you help them, the better the easier your job becomes, in consecutively reviewing those packages from year to year. The better the subrecipient starts to understand the requirements, and it's just a win-win situation for the people that are submitting the package and also the reviewers. So I hope that helps out, Margaret. By no means is this the end all. It's a good example because it's all inclusive, or pretty darn close to all inclusive, of what any reviewer would look like. And if you're in the development side of the scene, then this is a good example that you can use to develop one as well. Okay, so let me keep going here with, we asked them for these identification because we opened up the workbook, which I'll do here, pretty quick here. And we started looking at the columns, and it's like, okay, this is cool, but what are all these codes? What do they mean? So they went column by column from their universe that they pulled down, and they started telling us. Let me just point out a couple of these. You'll see the responsible units here. This one here, object, detail, and title. And they told us what this column would help us for. It says basically classification of expenditures in their system, used to identify utility, facility, office expenditures, which are all indirect costs. This is a good one, and this is one that we always focus on when we're looking at the supporting documentation, and that is the description of the charge, the description of the cost. And they tell us right here, if you look in that description, it's going to help you identify whether that cost was unallowable or allowable. And you'll see when I open up the workbook, there's under their unallowable cost, which they extracted out of the universe because they can't include those. We'll look at some of those descriptions, and you can see why they're unallowable. A lot of them are food, some of them are entertainment, little things of that nature. And then they go on, and is there anything else special here? Oh, this is interesting. They wanted to identify the fund source. So they did F for FHWA and S for the state. So that was pretty good. So that's just a short description of the information that we'll take a look at here in the workbook here in just a minute. So then they talked about removing all non-cost pool transactions. So we mentioned before they removed centralized garage. Now, what they did here, and once again, this is a narrative that goes with the workbook. They could have attached the workbook to this document, and we do have some organizations that do that. In our development class, sometimes we make this statement. We say an ICAP could be the size of a phone book. That is actually realistic. If you look at the supporting documentation, I think I mentioned before that Excel workbook's like 158 megabytes. If you were to print that off in paper, it probably would be the size of a phone book. But here's what they've done is they've taken and in your EA type, which identifies the, let's back up and see what that is. It's the cost center used to track individual project administration costs. That's what the EA, and here in the centralized garage, the EA is type 29. So when I open up that workbook and I see that they've excluded all of EA type 29, I know that that's a centralized garage. And if you remember from up above, they opted to remove that. Same with DMV. They identify the responsible unit in the codes that their financial management system uses. And you can see that those are excluded as well. So they've done a narrative here of, once again, that matches their workbook that we can bounce back to and say, hey, what is that EA type 29? Oh, that's centralized garage. So when I'm looking at direct salaries and wages, when I'm looking at indirect cost pools, if I go over to the EA column, I shouldn't find any 29s. That's straight out of their finance system, and they're telling us how they're doing that there. This is important here. Remove all disallowed costs. That's the same as unallowable, disallowed, identified. And then they reference subpart E, which are the cost principles. And then they tell us exactly, what level they were doing it there. With regards to a material threshold, which is something outside of what we've talked about. But the bottom line is you won't find any unallowable cost in their indirect cost pool. Okay, this is kind of where they went. Okay, no, not necessarily here. Let me get this section and then I'll go into their SOP part, which I thought was impressive. Not required though. Okay, so identifying the indirect costs. Here we have a bunch of codes. When I look at that workbook, I'm going to see these codes. So all the centralized services charges to the indirect cost pool, and Vision is the name of their system. It's STARS or Vision. I think Vision is the state level, and then STARS is actually a sub-application used for the DOT. But you'll see Vision codes and a crosswalk from Vision codes to what they're showing us. But here they've identified every single one of those codes that we're going to see and what they are with regards to centralized services. So, general liability insurance, I can see that's 516,020, so on and so forth. This is really getting into the weeds already. But the important thing is that this lessened our questions that we needed to ask to understand their methodology. This just provided us the roadmap to what we're going to see in their supporting documentation. So that's their indirect costs and the different codes they used. And then we talk about identifying the direct cost pool. And here is where they really get into actual processes and procedures that are used internally. And you can see here, it's a narrative using the fiscal year expenditure data captured above. And they talk about building pivot tables and separate the data by Vision ID. So they basically took everything they were learning as developing their ICAP and what normally you would find in a desktop procedure or a standard operating procedure for the development of an ICAP, and they included it in this package. Not needed by no means, but it's impressive because we know that they have got sound procedures actually written at this point that they will be using to maintain that ICAP or possibly upgrade it or whatever they have to do. But you can see that it's literally step by step. They talk about the pivot table, which we don't ever see any of that. That's an internal process. But here's remove any project that is an anomaly or that otherwise would distort the ICAP. And then they've got some queries here. But anyway, it just goes on and on and on. And then we get down here and they start to talk about calculating the indirect cost rate, separating the direct cost base from the funding source, so on and so forth. And so this was above and beyond. It only took them a page and a half to do. We applauded it. By no means do we want less information. More information is always better, but they did a really good job on that. And only for the purpose of us, recognizing that they are aware of, what's going on. That's why we like to see it. So here we have other rates that are billed as direct. And again, they're talking here, their labor rate, which is their fringe rate. They're not including it, but they put it in here once again. The equipment usage rate, they're not including it in this package because they already have a rate. Same here with depreciation. Depreciation for their capital assets are all excluded from this entire plan. So we shouldn't see any of that, and we don't. Now we move to a whole different section. And this is where the ICAP starts to call out centralized service programs and descriptions. So they sent us to a website on this one. I'll show you the link. We don't need to go out there. I showed it to you yesterday or the day before. I think it was right after Bob talked about central services. We went out there and looked at it. But this is a cut and paste right out of the state of Vermont's central service program descriptions. Not really a lot of relevant information here. Other than the fact they are including more descriptions for understanding, if you want to dive into that centralized service. But keep in mind, really the only thing that's required for centralized services is a summary of, historical summary of the years, how much centralized service funding was provided to that organization. However, the link, which was right here that they did provide, if I'm reviewing this, which we did, if we're reviewing this, then, if we wanted to bounce out there and take a look, then, they gave us the link. So that was pretty cool. This is all still more centralized services, basically stuff that's being provided at the state level. And the DOT really doesn't have an expenditure there. It's the state, but you can see a list of, some of them: workers' compensation fund, medical insurance. I mean, obviously, if you're working for a Department of Transportation, you're considered a state employee. So the state kicks in on all these various central services. So once again, this was just a cut and paste, really not of great importance, other than the fact that they provided above and beyond. Okay, this is kind of important. If you remember the org chart, and we'll see it again when I open the workbook because I specifically pasted it in there. But here, as I remember, their vision is their system along with stars. I can't quite figure out which is which, but I think the vision is at the state level. And then the stars is something more of a Department of Transportation spinoff from the state system, and we see that regularly. But at any rate, here's their various divisions, and what's important here is they're providing us those IDs. So all those 81, those numbers beginning with 81, those are all going to be from the Highway Division Maintenance Bureau. And then you can see the responsible units that they put down there. And once again, and you'll see how crazy when I open the workbook, if you didn't have this map, you kind of be dead in the water. You'd end up calling the person back and say, hey, I love your supporting documentation. It looks like you downloaded 158 megabytes of a boatload of numbers and codes, but I don't have a clue what you're doing. They're all pasted. And then I actually had to do that at the very end. It wasn't completely, but there was a few areas that I was still unclear about in reviewing their supporting documentation. But having this as a guide does two things: lets us know that they know what they're doing, and also gives us a roadmap to where we can kind of verify what they're doing. Okay, so that was all the department identifications and the various codes that we're going to see. There's your centralized garage that we wouldn't see anything from because they've excluded it, but yet in their universe of data from their finance system for that entire year, whether it be 18, 19, or 20 for their historical data, we're going to see, and we could recognize where they've excluded those. So that's what all this is about. Applying the rate, this is important. We've talked about this before. So the rate will be applied in stars to all direct payroll expenditures charged to the federal awards to determine the amount of the chargeable indirect cost. And then it goes on to just explain what does that look like. They even talk about here, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, I can just explain it to you, but they talk about here, you know, how the last payroll in their fiscal year crosses over that fiscal year, and how STARS is designed to ensure that the indirect cost rate for that payroll period is able to be manipulated when it crosses over the fiscal year. Remember, these ICAPs are for a period of time. It's a window. That window is usually the fiscal year. Well, you're going to have costs that are incurred during the fiscal year, but come July 1st, if that cost was incurred, meaning a direct cost or an indirect cost, your system has to be able to recognize when it's being put into the system a week later than when that cost was actually incurred. And so they talk about all that here, and the necessary adjustments that would have to occur for payroll corrections. I think they have that right here. Yeah, for payroll corrections that occurred during the time period, so on and so forth. But I pretty much explained it to you. So, but this is good. They're telling us how their system is going to be able to effectively apply that rate in various scenarios, whether it's just normal throughout the fiscal year or even when you come up to fiscal year end, where your indirect cost rate, or at least that specific percentage, might change as you cross over that fiscal year. So this is really, really good. Once again, it's telling us they're aware of it and they have a plan for applying the rate. And we've talked a lot about that in the last couple of days, applying the rate and system capabilities. So that kind of goes in line with that. Here's more of your centralized statewide cost allocation plan. Once again, this is just the various portions of costs that they put in here for their SWICAP. That link I jumped out to the other day that showed the various state departments, and I went all the way down to the bottom for the Department of Transportation. That's what all this is at. And again, that's straight out of their statewide cost allocation plan. So it's nothing crazy about that. And there's the link that they provided, which is their statewide cost allocation plan, SWICAP. Okay, then we get into the financial schedules. Let me make sure I didn't skip nothing. Okay, so remember, they provided 3 years of historical data. And here are their summary tables. Keep in mind, the summary is the key word in there because they basically rolled up all of their data dump from these various fiscal years. And oh, by the way, when you see the workbook that I've been talking about how big it is, that's only 1 year. What we're going to look at today and possibly a little bit tomorrow is FY20. They provided us 3 workbooks, one for 18, one for 19, and one for 20. And you can see they've rolled up all of that information into here. So these are the tables for the indirect cost base, okay? And you can see direct payroll without the load factor they've identified. They're all same, the fiscal years are all the same here, but we're looking at 18 right now. But they've identified the federal direct payroll, the state direct payroll. They do have a couple of locals here. I think they have an explanation somewhere in there about what that's all about. But anyway, you get down here to the bottom and once again, they separated federal from state, and they notice they have a remove DMV here. So everywhere you go in these numbers, they've recognized any exclusions, but you can see their ending total here for their payroll, direct salaries and wages base as being 15.1 million. And then you can look, and it's the same for 19. A little difference in the numbers. DMV obviously removed, but back then they had a 14.4 million. Again, this is just a roll-up summary, and then here's your FY20, and we're back to a 15.1 million with those. And then they actually show us what the percentage is for their fringe benefits. So they actually showed down here, and it's more just an FYI. You won't see any other computation in here for that, but they just tossed it in there for each fiscal year, letting us know what that fringe rate is. Okay, so that's one, and we're not even in the workbook. These are all summary information. Then they did a variance. The variance is nice to see because if you're using historical data, Bob showed it on the equipment rate that he was representing this morning. It's nice to see the variance from 1 year to the next. And that just kind of gives you an idea of if their indirect costs are shooting through the roof for any specific reason, or if their direct costs, because if you have a large jump in between that 3-year period, that's going to lead you to just ask some questions. Why did your indirect cost, I'm just pulling this off the top of my head. Why did your indirect cost increase $3 million in 2018? We did have one here in Vermont. I believe it was from, actually, I think it was 19s that increased. And we asked them about that. And if I remember correctly, it was, or maybe it was a direct cost. I'm forgetting now, but one of those. But they explained it. I think it was a flood or something in the state that increased. There was quite a bit of a jump. And so we asked them, what's that variance from? And that was the explanation. A couple of things here I wanted to note, and you'll see this in other areas, but, and I don't know if I can put it right in here. Manual adjustment to move the director's office salary, wages, expenditures from the base. So under direct salaries and wages, the director's office, because it's a charge, but it's not a direct charge. It should be in their indirect cost pool. So they removed it from their direct salaries and wages because his wage supports the entire program. So they included it in the indirect cost pool and not in the base. So little tiny things like that you see reminds us and reminds them of, what the heck's going on here, and that they're conscious, about what they're doing. So that was good. Let's see. I think we're almost done. Oh, more variance from 2019. So they went from 2018 to 2019. And this really these get further into the details, because now this is by department. You can see their direct cost base being from each different department. So, when we talk about financial systems, being able to do this, whether it be by department, like this example shows, or by activity, or whatever, that organization can organize these cost pools in, is extremely important. Your system has to be able to do that, or should be able to do that, unless you're doing like a simplified method or something of that nature, and you wouldn't need to necessarily break them down to this detail. But okay, so right here, and I want you can mark in your participant workbook, put a comment or something, but starting on page 136, these are additional stuff that Bob added to this. These are definitions. They do not go with the ICAP example. So the last page of the ICAP example was 135. Starting right here, these are information that we've provided in some of our other classes that might be, oh, wait a second, I apologize. This one does go. I just saw the vision and the stars. I apologize. This is part of the ICAP. There's some definitions there. Hopefully you didn't mark it up yet, because there's a description of the stars, the statewide agency, and then vision, which is the Oracle PeopleSoft piece of it. Okay, right here. Okay, yeah, right here is where Bob added some appendices here to the example. So starting on 137, these are just some acronyms that FHWA uses, and you'll see how federal agencies are with abbreviations, so in acronyms. So there's just a whole bunch of them that we added. Also a glossary of terms that was also added by us, has nothing to do with the indirect cost allocation plan example that we were showing. Let me come down here, because this is, the glossary is very helpful anytime you're dealing with FHWA or even federal agencies, because they're all pretty much the same now that 2 CFR 200 came out. Here are some popular links that might be of interest to you that Bob included as well. You've got Buy America, Consultant Services, and these are all just references to various regulations, various guidance, various pieces of information that you'll find. So that's part of your whole package and not part of the ICAP, starting from 137 all the way to the end. Okay, let me stop here and ask if there's any questions before I jump over to the workbook. Any questions about this ICAP example? Okay, once again, the expectation here is that it doesn't have to be exactly this way, but this is just a good starting point. This is a template that I think any organization could use to start understanding what the requirements are and what it actually looks like. When we helped Vermont, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, this is Bob, Eric. I was just going to add one thing, and basically like what Eric just said. And when we talk tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about review, exactly what Eric said. This is a good example, but what how you develop yours and what yours looks like may or may not look like this one. This is a state DOT. I know, Margaret, you were talking about developing billing rates. So yours will, yours is going to should have some supporting documentation and spreadsheets and documentation and calculations for how you came up with your billing rates. And then there should be some sort of narrative or explanation that, tells whoever you're submitting those to for approval, how they were developed. So tomorrow, when we talk about reviewing, we'll, like Eric said, we'll probably revisit this ICAP. I have another ICAP we can show as an example. It's another state DOT one, but they do look different. So just keep that in mind, that really the principles, which we're going to go over tomorrow in the review part, are the most important things. Like, if you look at the structure of how this review plan was set up, we have a scope, or kind of an introduction in the beginning. So what is the purpose? What's the objective? Then we have kind of a walkthrough of their methodology and, a summary at the very beginning. So all of those kind of points, if you just follow this kind of table of contents, these are the most important points that we need to make sure that are in an ICAP. How it's described and the methodology behind it and the process is going to be varied widely based on, like Eric said, systems. Is it a Quicken or a QuickBooks system? Is it a PeopleSoft, very comprehensive electronic data system? Or is it a spreadsheet? We don't know, and it's going to vary. So just keep that in mind, and it'll make a little bit more sense tomorrow as we're doing the review part, as we walk through what do we want to look for in the ICAP. This is going to be a good review because we're looking at an ICAP right now. So tomorrow when we do review, it's going to make more sense, I think.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yep. The other thing too is beg, borrow, and steal. I mean, when we started off with Vermont and Wyoming, Bob mentioned it, is another example. Actually, Wyoming is the one that we used to use, which, oh, by the way, is more complex than this one. This one here, Vermont chose to do a simplified allocation method, whereas Wyoming is a multiple rate method. So complete two different animals, but like Bob said, everything that you see on the screen now, that table of contents, are included in both of them. When Vermont started down the road for claiming indirect cost, Wyoming's was the one we gave them a copy of and said, hey, here's a copy of an ICAP, take a look at it, take a look at the things that are included in here. If you can get this in your ICAP, you're going to be pretty good to go. And they took the ball and ran with it. And with the exception of the various allocation methodologies, and obviously personalizing it for Vermont DOT and not Wyoming DOT, is exactly what they did. So if you've got other good examples, by all means, use those, share those if it's appropriate, and that organization doesn't mind. And that's the way to get things done, especially if you're developing. If you're developing, getting your hands and your eyes on one of these is really the greatest starting point that you could provide for anybody on that. So yeah, good points, Bob. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's go through this one more time. I really quickly did it. I believe it was day one. But I want to go through it a little bit, because now that we've looked at the ICAP and all the descriptions, now when you come to look at the supporting documentation, this is where it really makes sense. So the procedures, I told you they kind of included those. They also included in the workbook. And this was not necessarily for our purposes. This was for their internal operation, that they included this sheet of basically how to pull down from their universe. Let me click over to their universe. This is the FY data universe. Hopefully my Excel, oh, there, it responded pretty quick. Here are the thousands and hundreds of thousands of rows that they pulled for fiscal year FY20 of all of their data, to start querying, extracting, and so on, to get to those various pools that we're going to see here. So here's your indirect cost codes. Remember, they talked about the object detail and those specific codes. They mentioned utilities, facilities, and office, and what those are. So this is just a description, and this is manually put together. This isn't pulled out of the system. I mean, maybe they cut and pasted from some various parts of the system to get this information, but basically this is kind of a roadmap regarding object detail and object detail title, for the various indirect costs and costs. Here's your responsible units. There's that org chart. I just pasted that in there because they had already color coded. These with green and blue in their workbook. And when I opened the ICAP and actually just preparing for this presentation, I thought, well, you know what? I mean, the color code's exactly the same, so why not just paste it in there and everybody can see what we're talking about. So here's your DMV orange, which is the support. That was an indirect, but didn't matter. It's excluded anyway. Down here, you've got some other excluded, and by the looks of this, I can't exactly tell.
Probably motor vehicles.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good catch, yeah, motor vehicles, but not so much important, because as you'll see, once we get over to these exclusion tabs, that these codes match. So here's your vision department IDs, and in that appendix that we saw, it talked about what the vision codes here, but here's the departments. Remember that 81,000 or whatever, the 8100 lead in. You can kind of start to see that a little bit, but again, this is just up front. Nothing that you really need to fully understand during this, just only to the point that they have these various descriptions and departments identified. And oh, by the way, they color coded it. Now, most of the time we don't see a lot of color coding, but Bob and I had the opportunity to request certain things as they were developing, just for the purposes of our understanding and their understanding as well. But the end product turned out really well. So once again, you can see the orange there that are excluded, all Department of Motor Vehicles. And yes, you were absolutely right. Those other codes were of motor vehicle. There were a couple of times where I did look back at this and say, okay, I think it was, there was one, oh, maybe not on this sheet. I think it's maybe on this vision account. So I was looking at a specific vision account. I thought it was 50214. There was one I was looking at. So here's another one. And again, this is a data dump. By no means are we trying to get you to fully understand any of this. The goal here is just to understand that this is something that you might see, or something that you should somewhat expect, is that they've done a data dump to get, to get to their end result of their cost pools and the rate calculation, the exclusion, and so on and so forth, any unallowables and so on. They had to go from their universe and literally step by step. If any of us are familiar with systems or databases or whatever, you start with the universe and you start extracting using queries and so on and so forth. And then sometimes you've got to even go further where we get into these unallowable costs and do some other stuff. So again, the goal here is not to where you fully understand this other than the layout, the format, and the information that's being provided, and knowing that they have a process to pull all this stuff together. So here's some chart field additions. You can see some COVID style additions up here. And when I say additions is what this is your, we talked about historical data. And in their historical data for 18, 19, and 20, these specific items were not included, but yet they needed to identify going forward, and COVID was one of them. There's COVID-19, paid not worked, things of that nature, and here's your FY20 object details. So they had to include, and we'll see some of these over in the direct pools and also in the indirect pools of some additional type things they had to add for future. This is just the data universe. And like I said, if I tried to scroll right now, my computer would probably turn off like it did yesterday. So I'm not going to do that. But I will scroll a little bit from left to right and just see there's probably, gosh, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 columns. And I think I highlighted on some of these. They had called out the object detail field and what that was. I think the EA field, yeah, here's the EA field over here, which was important to us. So I highlighted a couple of those. Here's a description that's within, and you'd have to scroll back over to the right and see how over here, let me just go a little further. They have dollar amounts and everything in here for their extraction purposes. Here's their allowability. So as you scroll down here, and I dare try this, as a matter of fact, I won't, but you can see some things are considered load factor. Here's your object detail title, which is very important. But you can see that right off the bat from this universe, they started tagging allowable and unallowable. Oh, here's a subscription right here that's unallowable. They were able to identify that. Here's some water, which is probably bottles of water that are excluded, $171 worth. Okay, so probably providing water for a construction crew or something of that nature. I'm just scrolling down just in the universe environment. I'll show you the tab for all of this. There's some more water, I'm trying to find something that may be out of the ordinary here. Let me do this. Hopefully my system will allow me to do it. But they started doing this. Remember in the very beginning, we said, one of your first objectives is to separate directs from indirects. That's your first step. And then next would be starting to identify unallowable costs. And here's a boatload of them right here. There's a bunch of water. Here's some bank service charges. You can see I'm looking at this column right here. But as I arrow down, let's see if we can find some other. There's some clothing, yard goods. There's yarn, interesting stuff. Small claims awards to individuals, dues for memberships, just a whole bunch of stuff. But they've done it right here. But let's move on because this was just the universe, but this is where they started. And they didn't do this individually, by the way. Their system is pretty much coded like most systems are. And that is to not even allow certain coded cost to be requested for reimbursement. And I'm sure that's with Caltrans as well. So if you have subrecipients, they know what, what charges for whether it be state dollars or even federal dollars that are reimbursable and which ones aren't under the federal program. So here is, remember I pointed out EA type 29, which was the central garage. So here from the universe is what they did is they just made this query and they pulled every single thing out of that universe that had to do with the central garage. Now, even though these are allowable, because they would have been allowable under the cost principles, excluded and allowable are two different things. So these were tagged as allowable cost under the cost principles, but not for the purposes of developing the ICAP, because this turned into an exclusion and not an unallowable. Here's their fringe. So over here under the description, you can see these are all types of fringe benefits that were provided. And this tab indicates that they've excluded all of those. So, and once again, they've got a whole bunch of columns here, but the objective that we're trying to show you is the process of exclusion in this specific example. And so you can just kind of see the various descriptions of all of the fringe from this fiscal year, all of the fringe being removed, extracted. And they show right here that that's been extracted. Here's the other one, DMV. If you remember from our ICAP narrative, they talked about removing DMV for various reasons, not really important, other than the fact that they removed them. And here it's represented very clearly that they've extracted it from the universe. Any DMV, whether it be direct or indirect. Here's your unallawables. I did the filter a few minutes ago on the universe, but here they've done the filter and removed the data over into one sheet. And, once again, you can kind of look at it if you're interested. Here's the object detail, recognition awards, but you can kind of get an idea that they have an understanding of the cost principles and unallawables. That's the important, is that what we're seeing is accurately represented. Here they have grants direct. So this is grants that they're either providing out to a vendor. Here's a University of Vermont. Here's a county regional planning, all of this. And they've recognized this. It isn't really part of their calculation other than to segregate. Because once again, they're using this for the transportation piece, the highway piece, and they're a little bit unique because they're only looking for a certain dollar amount. These are just representative of the other pass-through type stuff that's going on within the agency. Here's your other direct funding. And there's a lot more here. I've trimmed these down to just these couple, but you can see that this is rail construction. So this is just another query that they pulled out that you could see. If I undid all of these, it looks like there's 15,000 rows of other direct type funding being provided. Okay, now we get into really the nuts and bolts. And here is, after all of that stuff is done, the exclusions and so on, is what we're looking at now is payroll charges, which is their direct cost base, salaries and wages. So everything that you see here is what's going to make up their base. And you can see the dollar amounts. You can see whether it's federal or whether it's state or whether it's local. They kind of identified that in some of the narration that they did. But is what I want to show you is if you come down to the bottom, and they also have an allowable and unallowable column as well in there. But here's your totals that you can expect to see with regards to your direct cost basis for your direct salaries and wages. So once again, the extraction of all payroll, salaries and wages, and then boom, this is the number that we would tie out. We would take a look at this 15.174 for FY20 and marry it up. Then we move to the indirects, same type of thing. This is the extraction of all of their allowable and allocable indirect costs. And here's their descriptions over here. And don't need to go through them. Bob and I went through them and just kind of glanced at them and did some sorting. Sometimes you might get these and they're not, they're not ready. They're not set up for sorting. It's just data dumps and so on. They may have done some totals at the bottom, but you throw some of these up here and you can kind of look, what are some of these indirect costs that are making up their pools? There's education supplies, electricity, equipment, office. I mean, you can just kind of glance and see, is there something that looks weird in here that might not be an allowable, allocable indirect cost? And, if you're interested, you can kind of look at some of the detail lines on this just to kind of see. We didn't really have too much problems with that. They had a really good understanding of what's all this about. But once again, when you arrow down for this FY and you get to the very bottom, you can see some totals going on here for their indirect cost pools. And there's 21,639,000. And so these are numbers that we would want to tie back out. And you as all auditors know exactly what I'm talking about here. And then finally, we bump over to the summary. And here's a very similar of what we saw in the narrative of the methodology, the ICAP package itself. And this is where, we told them they had actually done this part on the workbook. And we said, well, this needs to be it as your summary piece in your actual ICAP, So they basically, once they've gone through the fiscal years and tidied everything up, boom, they just basically took this and cut and pasted it right in there. And it looks familiar because this is exactly what we saw. And this is the summary. So for FY20, we've got, the indirect costs. We've got the direct cost salaries over there. They did have an adjustment down here that we talked about a little bit. But basically 151.53% for FY20 if they would have had one. This is one workbook for one fiscal year. And, if they get it right on, on this one, then, you kind of quickly browse, but their procedures we were so confident in their procedures. And, we kind of spot checked 18 and 19. But, once you get really familiar, and this kind of goes to the risk-based type thing, once you see that the procedures are in place to do this and you kind of do a quick comparison from one fiscal year to the next, you don't need to spend a lot of time drilling into 3 years of data and, cross-reference every single piece of the data. That's not really the intent. Okay, so that was another example.
Got about 7 minutes left, Eric, just to let you know.
Okay. Well, let's open it up for discussion, and then we'll kind of talk about tomorrow. But let's open this up for discussion because I've been rambling for an hour now on, these examples. So are any thoughts going on out there? Any questions, clarifications?
It's me again, Margaret. So I guess in my world, the part that would be more applicable is whatever that piece is that was not included, which was the fringe benefits part. Mm-hmm. So I just want to get an idea of how that's used. Is it that as a state entity, they are already being reimbursed somehow for staff costs through this fringe benefit rate? I'm not sure how that worked.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the state, and like most DOTs, I mentioned only 33 states have an actual indirect cost allocation plan, but there's more states that include fringe benefits and or equipment rates with their programs. So they charge those, the fringe and the equipment to the federal program. And those are done with individual rates. So Vermont already had a fringe rate that they've been charging for many years. and they already had an equipment rate, which they've been, recovering all of their, like Bob showed, maintenance, depreciation, and so on through their equipment rate and all the fringe rate for their employees. And so those are the reasons why those were excluded from this plan. The example I did mention before, a state that we're working with that had so many, they're working, I believe, on their 6th different type of rates, are we're trying right now to persuade them, for just the better good going forward, to consolidate those into one plan. You can have, just as Bob mentioned, an indirect cost allocation plan that includes your fringe and includes your equipment. Those would just be separate pools, but they're included into your one rate that you would be charging. So you can have it not quite 6 different ways to Sunday, but if you have 3 or 4 different rates going on, that's not a big thing. You might have a fringe rate, an equipment rate. You might have another special rate for a special activity. You could have a narrative like the local public agency coordinator, that you guys have out there at Caltrans. So you can have, a few rates, but at some point in time, it might be beneficial to incorporate, because you can have one ICAP that includes all of those. They're just going to be identified as different pools and different activities.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I also wanted to let everybody know, and thank you, Sherry. She put the Federal Highway ICAP review guide in the chat pod. So that's what we're going to be going through tomorrow. Take a look at it. It's going to be a little overwhelming. It's quite long, and it's split up into different sections. So there's a section that covers, narrative. There's a section that covers centralized services. There's a section that covers indirect costs, and then there's a section that covers kind of an initial review. What we're going to be going through tomorrow is going to be the indirect cost section. So if you could just look at that section, look at the whole document if you'd like, but that's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So if you could just kind of go through that and become familiar with it, and we'll basically walk through that, and we'll talk about all of the different things that we have to think about for when we're reviewing, because now that we've seen one and we've talked about what goes into developing one, and we've talked about all the documentation that's necessary, tomorrow we'll be doing that review and talking about, how do we review it, and the negotiation process that we would do, or the pastor entity would do at Caltrans. And so that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Bob.
Yep.
Let me hit this one last slide. This is submission and Cognizant agency approval. We've already talked about this, but this one part up here, submit completed proposal and all supporting documents to the Cognizant agency within 6 months after the fiscal year close. You as a Cognizant agency, as Caltrans, if you're not holding your subrecipients to the fire on this one, I would highly recommend it. We have had to put some of our DOTs on notice for late submission. And when I say on notice, I just mean kind of a hand slap. Your workforce there with your auditors that are reviewing these ICAPs, they deserve the amount of time that the Cognizant agency needs, especially if you're dealing with 80 or so a year. So if they're not submitting on time, I'd pick up the phone and do a little butt chewing or whatever you need to do to try to keep all of these organizations on the time frame that's outlined in Appendix 7. It pays off in the long run to do that. And I have one final slide. I think I have 30 seconds left. So like Bob said, the ICAP example, if you want to take another look at that, for sure, the review guide that Sherry posted out there in the chat. And then I tossed this out here. I don't know if you guys are willing to do this, but if you've been reviewing ICAPs, which most of you have some sort of a hand in that, if you have any specific issues that you are dealt with in a consistent basis that keep popping up, or any specific issues that you're currently working on that you would like to bring to our attention. Maybe you could even share it on screen if you want tomorrow. I think we have quite a bit of time tomorrow left over. So if you guys have anything specific you want to bring to the conversation or the discussion, by all means, bring it on. We'd love to take a look at it and, offer any comments or suggestions that we could possibly do.